This meeting is being recorded.
Hello and welcome to the March 2022 Tools for Thought speaker series. And we're starting with Gordon Brander. Take it away, Gordon.
I actually, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing. Is there any way you could flip that toggle for me?
I can fix that. Yeah,
Okay.
I suppose. Right. I have to figure out which button to press, of course.
Somewhere deep in the bowels of Zoom.
How about I just do this?
All right, it looks, aha, I think that worked. Okay, all right. Okay, can everyone see my big purple slide? Yeah, okay, I got a thumbs up there, great. I'm Gordon Brander, and I'm building a little tool for thought. I'm going to share a little bit about it as we go through this talk. It's frankly maybe a little bit underwhelming in some ways, or very simple. But I want to make an argument that perhaps what might be valuable today that I can share is kind of a way of seeing this problem space, and something that I'm indebted to a bunch of thinkers and like some particular theory frameworks for helping me gain purchase on this space and see it from a little bit of a different point of view. So I'm very inspired by this idea from Nintendo, which translates to lateral thinking with withered technology. So this is kind of an ethos that you see throughout Nintendo's products. I'm a designer. I also write code. I build products, but I primarily think of myself as a designer. And this notion, lateral thinking with withered technology, I feel like this is like a very designerly kind of dream. Like the idea is that you can sort of take ingredients which may have been laying around for a long time potentially and ignored, and by learning to see them in a different way, you can find the fun. You can sort of find a new way of seeing them and maybe make a creative breakthrough or take a different approach. So you kind of see this, in early Nintendo stuff with the Game Boy, like taking components that were really kind of out of date for that time period, but like rethinking what the job is for video games. And then today, like I gotta say, I'm just such a sucker for like Nintendo Labo. It's so cool. Like, cardboard, like who would have thought, right? So kind of in that spirit, if you have been in this space for a while, you've probably heard this framing of note-taking as building a second brain, like this kind of concept of externalizing your memory, externalizing your thought process, and then hopefully if that system works, that being some kind of multiplier on your effectiveness for thinking. I want to maybe try to reframe that just a little bit, like tweak it a few degrees to the left, and sort of think of it as like, what if we, instead of we're trying to build a second brain, what if we tackled this as trying to build a second subconscious? So that's kind of what I'm up to with subconscious, a little bit of a twist on this space. And I think it has led me to some of the same places, but maybe some new places as well, which I'm excited to share. This is a audience, I think, where a lot of us are actually building our own tools. So I thought I might take advantage of the folks here and maybe treat this as a chance to share my design notes. So this talk is going to be a little bit theory heavy. I want to kind of explore the set of questions that I find myself confronting when I'm building a tool in this space. And I will be sharing some screenshots and some of the actual product that I'm building. But really what I'd love to do is sort of share maybe a way of seeing this space that might be a little bit oblique and a little bit different. And sort of a why versus a how sort of talk. Note-taking. I have been taking notes for maybe 10 years. I've got a folder somewhere with like a few tens of thousands of notes spanning those 10 years. And at first this started for me because I'm kind of ADD. I had trouble coping with like a work environment where I had to keep track of a lot of details. So it was like a survival strategy at first. And then it became kind of a practice. And I've used a lot of tools over the years, probably like a lot of you here. Actually, up until I got Subconscious working on my mobile phone, it was mostly IA Writer. So it's a lot of simple tools. Like for me, having access to the files is pretty important. I think I find that with a lot of these tools, my process feels a little bit like this, right? Like I take a note, I sort of chuck it into the tool, and it goes into the bottomless pit. Maybe I never see it again. And then when I'm confronted with a creative challenge, I find myself sort of staring into the abyss. And you'd think like, okay, I've got 10 years of context, right? Like I've got 10 years of creative notes that I've been taking for myself. Like somehow they just aren't here. Like they don't come back to me. So I found this really cute comic about the creative process, and it seems like I'm not the only person who has this challenge, right? This kind of like, what is the creative process? You stare into the abyss, you grind your teeth, and you think harder, right? And I've heard this a lot, like, oh, like writing is hard because writing is thinking, and thinking is hard, right? And so if you're not being creative, you just need to think harder, right? Like rise and grind. And I want to suggest that maybe thinking is overrated. I look at this this problem here, and I think maybe there's a flow problem, right? So we have a lot of tools, I think, out there. They are confronted with this kind of challenge, and they offer sort of features like categories or folders or tags, and this probably works for some folks. At least for me, though, it kind of feels like now instead of one hole to toss my notes into and never see them again, I have several. Like we're bucketing things, but like fundamentally stuff is just not coming back to me. Like notes go in, but they don't come back. Now there's a word for this kind of a system. It's called a feed forward system. And this is from a specific sort of theory space called cybernetics, which thinks about like the flow of things within systems. So in a feed forward system, information only moves in one direction. So you get this kind of linear behavior, right? You put stuff in, it goes in one direction, there's input, there's output, it's linear. You get exactly out of those systems the amount of effort that you put in. So if I want, access to my notes in this creative space, I have to like manually go and retrieve them and bring them into my creative context. So there's like, effort that I have to expend in order to get a reward. This is in contrast, a feed forward system is in contrast to something called a feedback system. Again, this is like a concept from cybernetics. So you've probably experienced a feedback system yourself, like when you plug a mic into an amp and you bring it a little too close, and maybe the tiniest little whisper, right? It'll get fed into that amp and amplified, and then picked up by the mic again, and then amplified again in this recursive sort of looping behavior. And if you've ever experienced this, like the tiniest little whisper will rapidly be amplified into like a room shaking sound. And this is an interesting property of feedback systems, is that they produce nonlinear behavior. So the output becomes the input, becomes the output, becomes the input, and you get this kind of like this S curve type of, or like exponential curve kind of behavior, nonlinear. And it turns out actually, when you start to apply this lens to systems, that a lot of systems are feedback systems. Like basically everything in biology is a feedback system. You can look at markets as a feedback system. Computers, we talk about like the human-computer interaction loop. That's a feedback system. And actually cybernetics was this huge breakthrough that enabled computing to happen at all, to be able to conceive of these systems in this sort of cyclical, recursive way. So kind of taking this lens, I want to ask the question, what if my notes could think back? What if instead of having a feed forward system where I just sort of chuck my notes into the void, never to return, they actually come back to me and produce some kind of interesting nonlinear outcome. So I'm lazy. I don't want a system where I only get back the amount of effort that I put in. Or potentially less. So this is an interesting sort of provocation for me, at least. And there's one theory in particular that really helped me sort of come to a few creative breakthroughs with subconscious and with the sort of tools for thought space in general. And that's Pask's conversation theory. So this is one of the sort of theory groups within cybernetics. And Pask's goal was to sort of construct a theory of how we learn, or how systems in general learn, and what creativity actually is. It's like a way of seeing creativity. And he sort of conceives of learning and creativity as a conversational feedback loop between a self and an other. So I made a little sketch, like a napkin sketch, of sort of Pask's view of the world. So this is sort of Pask's constructivist theory of learning through communication. So the way that this works is, let's say I'm having a conversation with Boris, and we're exchanging messages together through shared language and a shared environment. Our shared environment right now is Zoom, so we're kind of like bouncing ideas back and forth. And as we do this, each of us is building up a mental model of what we think the other is thinking. So this is what maybe philosophers would call a theory of mind, right? Like I say something, I see Boris receive it, and I start to build up a model of like what I think Boris thinks that I think, right? And Boris is doing the same thing. And this is kind of like a circular process. We keep going until we reach a sort of mutual agreement that we both think that the other thinks that we agree, right? And this is not an exact thing. These are subjective models, which I've represented in my little napkin sketch with, like, we're both talking about, you know, sort of QB-like things, but this guy, he's thinking about like a chocolate bar shape, and this guy's thinking about a cube. Maybe that's good enough for the purpose of this particular space. In computing, we might sort of think of this as like an eventual consistency system, right? Like we're both sort of exchanging messages, and our views of the world are a little bit different, but we're going to come into some sort of eventual synchronization with enough messages exchanged. So the interesting thing is that for Pask, you can sort of take this view of systems and apply it not just to conversations between people, but you could also look at it as conversations between maybe yourself and your mental model of a person. And you could potentially sort of come to a similar place, right? Like that, I've been around, you know, my parents for long enough, and I have like maybe a mental model of what they think, and I can sort of play that back in my head, or my partner, right? Or maybe like a creative muse, like maybe I care. Like I've spent a lot of time studying a particular artist, and I can sort of model that artist in my head. So we could sort of think of conversations as between ourselves and another, ourselves and a mental model of another, or maybe ourselves and a model of a system. So this is like a big idea in the sort of Alan Kay kind of tools for thought, Doug Engelbart sort of headspace, that like we can create these models of systems, and by interacting with them, we can actually kind of become more effective at thinking about those systems. So you have like Alan Kay saying things like, hey, scientists who know calculus are fundamentally more effective at solving certain kinds of problems than even the smartest people were before the invention of calculus. So calculus is like a kind of model that lets us interrogate certain kinds of systems in a way that might be useful. So we're kind of having a conversation with the system, or with the model of the system, through that medium. I can also potentially have a conversation between myself and myself, as mediated through pencil and paper. So I don't know about you, but I don't write at the speed of thought, and like this delay actually between the thinking and the writing creates a little bit of a gap, and there's this kind of subject object shift that happens. So I start to see my ideas from like a new point of view, and it's almost as if someone else has written them, right? There's the self who writes and the self who reads. And I think this like might be one way of understanding why writing and doodling can be so generative when sort of thinking through a problem space. So for Pask, the crucial thing here for these conversational systems to work and to generate creativity is for the self to allow the other to speak back. And the other here might be like myself and Boris, or it might be myself and my mental model of Boris, or it might be myself and some model of a system, or even myself and myself through pencil and paper. But in any case, what we're aiming for is a sort of mix of positive and negative feedback that helps us get a little bit out of control and arrive at a previously unknown destination. So we can sort of think of creativity as like a way of getting to places we didn't know existed before, right? If you already knew the destination, then it's not really creative. Like you're just going to a place that you already understood before. So we actually do want to lose control a little bit here. And if you've ever sort of like had a great creative partner that you riff with, and you sort of like mutually surprise each other and inspire each other, that's that past conversational process in action. You're sort of both helping each other get out of control and discover something new. So, given all that, I started thinking to myself, what if we took this note-taking process, which is sort of feed forward, notes go into the bottomless pit, and we reimagined it as a conversation between my past and future self as mediated through my notes. So instead of my notes just kind of going in one direction, they could loop back to me. And I could think of these as sort of messages I'm writing, putting in a bottle that should float back to me at some point. Now, keen listeners here are probably thinking, hey, this sounds a little bit like spaced repetition. And that's because it is kind of like spaced repetition. And actually, I think spaced repetition is a conversational feedback loop between your past and your future self. And it's a conversational loop constructed for a particular purpose, which is memorization. So for those of you who haven't encountered these tools before, the basic notion is kind of like flashcards. Now, the idea is that we forget things. We tend to forget things at particular rates. And we kind of have a sense of what those rates might be because of various cognitive science studies that have been done over the years. And so the goal of a tool, a spaced repetition tool, like Anki is the one that I have pictured here, is to remind you of something, to basically resurface a note or a flashcard, and to do so along some frequency that depends on how hard a time you have remembering it. So you start to forget it, it reminds you, you start to forget it, it reminds you. So we could think of this kind of feedback loop to program memorization as a kind of negative feedback loop. So in cybernetics, a negative feedback loop is a loop that seeks equilibrium. So basically it seeks a steady state. And the steady state here is basically remembering the thing that we set out to remember. Another way of saying a negative feedback loop is a goal-seeking feedback loop. So the goal that we're seeking is to memorize. There's also sort of like a machine learning analogy we could use here, which is called convergence. And machine learning convergence is a goal-seeking behavior that asymptotically approaches some maxima. Basically, it gets closer and closer to the goal. It might never reach it, but it reaches some steady state where it's like close enough. Regardless of the analogy we're using here, the idea is that we sort of reach an answer and we stop looking. And in the case of Anki or spaced repetition tools, the answer that we're reaching is hey, I've memorized it. Like I'm remembering the thing that I set out to remember. And actually, Anki does basically the feedback loop slows down as you signal that you've remembered things. So eventually, it will nearly stop. So it's kind of a self-limiting type of system. So we can think of Anki basically and other spaced repetition tools as negative feedback systems designed to generate this behavior of convergence. So the thing is, though, for me, memorization is kind of boring. It's maybe not the most interesting way of thinking for me as a designer. It's obviously very useful to be able to program your memory for some kinds of fields, like maybe medicine or some spaces in engineering. But as a designer, I'm less interested maybe in converging. Somebody really wanted to emphasize that point. All right. Yeah. So I'm less interested as a designer in converging on like an answer that's already known. And I'm actually a little more interested in maybe asking the question, can we potentially use feedback loops to generate something like creativity instead? So instead of arriving at a known destination reliably, is it possible to construct some feedback systems that can help us arrive at unknown destinations that might be interesting? So maybe a lens on how we might approach this is another cybernetician, Horst Riddle, who defined creativity as the generation of variety and the reduction of variety. Or like, again, other frames from other disciplines, we have like the explore-exploit trade-off in robotics and in game theory. And sort of this positive and negative feedback idea from cybernetics. But at the end of the day, what we're really looking for in the creative process is not just convergence to a place that we already know, but actually a mix of divergence and convergence. And actually, there's a model for this. It's called the diamond model, and it's used all over in design studies. You may have seen it before, but it kind of usefully construes the creative process as a process that has two distinct kind of modes or parts. So in the first mode, divergence, our goal is to create choices, create ideas, generate options without too much judgment. So our goal is to sort of maximize the material that we have to work with. Then at some point, we basically flip and we change strategies and we go into convergence. And our goal is to kind of synthesize, edit, combine, cut, until we exit that process with some sort of solution or artifact or like end state. Now you can go through this process multiple times. This is called the double diamond model. You've probably seen it before if you've ever taken like a design thinking workshop or IDEO type book. A lot of design schools, a lot of design processes use this model as a way of sort of structuring our work. But the basic idea is you kind of go through this diamond process twice, and at the end, you have some sort of design solution, right? Now, this is great, actually, because it means that we can sort of think of one way of creating creativity that's somewhat reliable and that we can sort of think about and reason about. But it is still, this is a feed forward process. It's linear, right? Like we have a start and we have an end state. And then at the end state, we're done. The process ends. However, from a note-taking perspective, I don't want a feed-forward system. I would like a feedback system, like a sort of loop between my my past and future self as mediated through notes. So given that, what if we took this kind of diamond model and combined it with Pask's conversation theory? I am going to call this, I'm going to call this the tiara model, because that's kind of what it looks like. This is something that I was just sort of riffing on, trying to explain what I'm up to with subconscious. And I had all of these models floating around my head, and they just sort of like, you know, kind of combined together. And then the more I thought about it, the more this actually ended up being a useful lens on the problem space. So I've got a post linked here. I can link it in the chat later. But this is kind of my napkin sketch for why subconscious and how subconscious thinks about the process of generating ideas. So the goal is basically like we have this kind of divergence step where little idea atoms or snippets go into the funnel, and they're combined together, they're mashed up, they're unbundled, they're remixed. And our goal during that phase is to sort of like maximize the number of ideas. And there's, tools and features in the app that are designed to do that. And then there's this complementary sort of set of convergent feedback loops that take those little atoms, collide them together in a sort of particle accelerator way, see what sticks together, find links, combine them together. And at the end of this process, out the other end of the funnel, you get something like what Andy Machusek might call an evergreen note, right? Like this durable sort of knowledge artifact. But this is not just a feed forward process, it's linear. So those evergreen notes then get fed back into the funnel, maybe unbundled into component parts, mashed up together, remixed, and on it goes. So the goal here is to have a feedback system that sort of creates self-organizing ideas. What I'd really love is to kind of garden knowledge from the bottom up without having to sit down in front of, in front of the void and like think harder. What I really would love to do is to kind of like construct a feedback system that redirects my energy, these little micro interactions, and creates some sort of creative outcome in a kind of ambient way. So that's a lot of theory, but maybe that will help tee up kind of some of what I'm up to with Subconscious, my little app. In a lot of ways, this is not a super groundbreaking app. It's just a little kind of mostly run-of-the-mill note-taking app with just a couple of little tweaks. And these tweaks correspond pretty much one for one with the Tiara model here. So like once I had this theory framework, it helped me sort of understand and define the actual features that I wanted to implement in the app itself. And so the goal here is maybe not to kind of like create the next mind-blowing set of features, but just to kind of like tweak the energy in the system just a little bit, like a judo move, such that like it's redirected in a way that produces very different results. So let's take a look. So the landing page for Subconscious is nothing too crazy. It's actually a lot about this app is going to be underwhelming, just to sort of couch your expectations here. But it's just a reverse chronological list of ideas. And this is actually something I'm a little bit kind of opinionated about, is Subconscious is for ideas. Like my goal is to kind of create a tool to be able to garden ideas, combine them, remix them. So that helps me kind of like focus in. It's kind of nice. It's like, do I want to-dos and to-do features and a bunch of other stuff? Maybe not, right? It's like kind of helps me focus in. But anyway, reverse chronological list of ideas. But we got this weird little glowing orb in the corner here. And like this is maybe the first kind of unusual tweak that this theory framework helped influence. So when you tap on it, you end up in this mode, which I'm going to call search or create. So in Subconscious, anytime you create something, you do it through a search flow. And this is kind of an unusual choice. So it's maybe a little bit of a hurdle for new users to try, but it might be familiar to folks who have used notational velocity in the past. Actually, I think I have a slide about this. Yeah, so this is an older Mac app. I think it may have been abandoned since or forked, but completely inspired by the flow of this app. This app had almost no features, but it did have this one feature, which was the search or create flow. The interesting thing about search or create is that it closes a loop between your past and future self. So every time you go to create a note, you're actually recursing over old notes. And this little micro interaction actually closes the loop. It nudges you back toward these evergreen notes that are floating around in your subconscious, such that instead of like creating new notes all the time and throwing them into the void, you find yourself returning to old evergreen notes and editing them, adding to them, refactoring them. And over time, this tiny little convergent micro interaction will actually grow evergreen notes from the bottom up. I I've only been using Subconscious for myself for a few months now, as I've been prototyping it, but I feel pretty confident that this tiny little micro interaction is going to work because it worked for me in notational velocity. There are just a few sort of knowledge systems that have worked for me in the past, and that was one. And I was surprised to find that I was kind of gardening these evergreen notes without ever trying to. Like there was no point at which I sat down and triaged or anything like that. It was just these little tiny micro interactions. And it's all about that feedback loop, creating that nonlinear outcome. Next up, nothing too crazy here. We got link suggestions. I'm doing some funny stuff with markup, which there's a support for a language we're calling subtext. It's kind of markdown like, but it actually has a block-based object model under the hood. So whatever, not important. I won't go into it now. But the basic idea with links, I think there's nothing new here, but we can sort of think about them through this theory framework as both divergent in the sense that like a link suggestion might help you stumble upon things you hadn't thought about before. And also convergent in the sense that they help connect things together. Also, we have backlinks. Again, not too crazy. This is sort of like table stakes these days, post-Rome. But I think, again, having this sort of theory helped me think about the way in which I might want to reflect this in the product. So backlinks show up underneath your notes, and this is kind of a deliberate choice. So as your note grows from a sort of scratch note, and you're searching and creating and returning to it and growing it, that content's going to grow and it's going to push down those backlinks. So you could sort of think of this as like over time, your interaction with that idea is going to shift from primarily divergent, where you're sort of being reminded of content that might surprise you in the backlinks section, to primarily convergent as the note matures and gets longer and pushes those backlinks down. And that's by design. Like we want a sort of like learning journey for each of these ideas where they go from something that is sort of rough and ready to something that is a durable knowledge artifact. So far, this is all pretty run-of-the-mill stuff, maybe like a little bit of a different twist. It's mobile, that's cool. But I want to sort of talk about a little bit why I find theory as a designer so helpful in approaching these spaces. And that's because it's kind of like a generalizable map, or like it's like a machine for generating ideas. Like once you have the theory, you can start to think about the problem space, and it might lead you in directions that are unexpected. So I want to talk about one area that I have arrived at what to me when I started this process was a really unexpected place, and it was the theory that led me there. So sort of theory to idea kind of pipeline, and that's Geists. So this is something I'm working on for Subconscious beta. It's not in the alpha yet. We're still sort of prototyping. But basically, Geists are like these little bots. They live in your subconscious, and the goal of a Geist is to generate creative divergence. So finding connections between notes, colliding random ideas together, unbundling them and remixing them, and maybe most important of all, sort of issuing oracular provocations and gnomic utterances. So what do I mean by that? There's this sort of tradition of tools for thought, which might be a little bit left field, called oracles. And they've been really inspiring to me as I sort of explore this idea of like, how do you generate creativity? And I think maybe a really good sort of like entry into this design space is something like Brian Eno's oblique strategies. So maybe you've encountered these before. It's a deck of cards, and Eno created them. He was a music producer and often worked alone. And he would get into these sort of creative ruts where he was stuck with a creative problem and didn't have anyone to riff with to help get out of the rut. So these cards are something that he created for himself, sourcing kind of what I would think of as oracular provocations from others. Now, basically, the notion is each card has this sort of nomic utterance, right? Like faced with a choice, do both. When you're presented with a dilemma, creative dilemma, the idea is that you draw a card and then you try to carry out whatever's on the card in your creative context. Now, what does this card actually mean? So, like, actually, on its own, it doesn't really mean anything, right? It's too vague. It's too abstract to have any meaning by itself. But what happens when you actually apply it to a creative context is that you're constructing the meaning. You're sort of supplying a context, you're interpreting the card, and that interpretation is itself a creative act. So in a way, the card is kind of programming creativity on demand. It's like drawing creativity out of you, or like there's this really nice word, educe, which we don't really use anymore. It means to draw out that which is latent. So the card is like educing creativity, like something creative that was latent in you that needed a catalyst to be released. I guess one way we could sort of think about this is that these cards are actually facilitating a conversation, like a sort of past conversational feedback loop between yourself and your subconscious. So you're drawing the card, and in seeking to interpret the card within your creative context, you're actually drawing things out of your mind that were already there, but the card is sort of like causing you to approach this stuff from an oblique angle and maybe see solutions that you didn't see before. So the cards are kind of like a creative partner, or rather maybe they're helping your subconscious to be unlocked to be a creative partner. They're kind of daring you to create meaning, right? Like the meaning is constructed. It's not in the card, it's in you. And the card acts as this sort of catalyst within a context to draw that meaning out of you. So I really like this, and I really appreciate sort of Pask's conversation theory for giving me this perspective on tools, because it gives me a way of understanding things like tarot. Now, some people here might be like going, and others might be like, yeah. But I know, at least for me, tarot is something that feels very foreign and kind of like I'm squeamish about. I'm like this very annoying by nature, kind of rationalist type, right? So this feels very like out there for me. But at least one way of seeing tarot, or like one way of engaging with it, is to see it as this kind of conversational process. Like it basically sets up a narrative conversational loop between yourself and your subconscious. So you have this basically deck of cards, and on the cards there are all of these rich symbols, and these symbols often have like cultural meaning, right? So there's a lot of different sort of things in here that I could pick out, like the pentacle, this archway, the mountains in the background, the cup, the infinity sign. And within different contexts, these might mean different things. And actually, tarot has this kind of interesting kind of way of, one way to use these is you can kind of assign different meanings to different placements. So we could say maybe it's these three cards are past, present, future. And I can use a kind of combination of intuitive interpretation to actually craft a story, right? Like here's my 3-act story arc. So like one way we could actually see systems like tarot or the I Ching, or even like more gamey things like story dice, is as these kinds of procedural generators, like narrative procedural generators, right? And I love this because it sort of says to me, creativity can be procedurally generated. This is really exciting to me as a designer, because maybe this is like a very designerly problem, but like I live in dread of the like can't produce creativity moment, right? Like your job as a designer is to be creative, but like what happens if it just doesn't happen? But the cool thing about an oracle is it sort of suggests that actually you can provoke it. You can provoke it on demand. You can procedurally generate it if you need to. That's a pretty compelling idea to me. The other insight here, I think, that I can draw from things like oblique strategies and from tarot is that it doesn't actually take much to make meaning. It doesn't take much to provoke creativity. It just takes what I'll call spices. So basically, like very carefully curated ingredients. In the case of oblique strategies, this is these sort of provocations that Eno curated. In the case of tarot, it's the symbology, the symbol language, and the cards. But yeah, you have these spices, and then you have randomness, and this is like an insight. Let's see if I actually have this book sitting around. It looks like it might be buried in my stack of books, but an insight that you can often see repeated in games is, games actually use a lot of procedural generative sort of tools. But like often it's the simple systems that work the best. It's really about thinking really carefully about those ingredients. And then even something as simple as randomness can kind of like jog you into new territory and help you arrive at an interesting creative breakthrough. Sort of framing this in Pask's conversation terms, he had this quote that communication, so he means communication specifically like information theory communication, like bandwidth, like the mathematical theory around communication. But he says like communication and conversation are distinct. So conversation requires some communication. So you have to be able to exchange messages. But actually very bad communication can admit very good conversation. So actually, if you think about something like tarot in a sort of information theory terms, there's like not a lot of bandwidth in the system. There's not a lot going on here, right? There's a handful of cards and they never change, and then there's randomness. So there's like some states there, but it's not too crazy. But really, what's happening here is maybe the communication is not too crazy, but the conversation that it can provoke can be really profound, because it's sort of drawing the creativity out of you. Like you are the one who's providing all of the interesting ingredients to this system. So that insight, that's pretty heartening to me, because I'm not a super brain genius. I'm just like one person who likes to build, pretty simple software. And when I started thinking about this kind of idea of geists, like, hey, I want these like little spirits that live in my notebook that help me generate creative divergence. The first thing that people sort of came to me with was like, oh, well, what if you just sort of like use GPT-3, right? And you just kind of jam this giant large language model into your notebook, and it sort of like, maybe there's something really cool there. But actually, I think it might be interesting to start with something very simple, which is what I'm doing. I'm using this fun little library called Tracery. Some of you may have encountered this before. It's really cool. It's basically just this this tool. It takes a series of, you know what, you could think of it as like programming Mad Libs, basically. Like it takes a series of templates and it injects a little bit of randomness, and it basically generates stories procedurally using the ingredients that you've offered it. Now, the interesting thing about Tracery is that programming it is super simple, or comparatively simple, to a lot of things like GPT-3. Like you basically just give it a JSON file and away it goes. So I've been using Tracery to kind of prototype a handful of geists for subconscious. Is this coming through, by the way? Is the contrast okay? I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay, so this is just a screenshot of my terminal. I've got this goofy little kind of terminal script that I'm prototyping geists in. So eventually, when this makes its way into the app, it's not going to be like, terminal text. It's going to look more like a feed. So the home view of the app is going to switch from being a reverse chronological list of notes to something a little more like a social media feed, except that rather than being a feed of social media between you and your friends, it's going to be like social media between you and a bunch of these little geists that are taking your notes and remixing them and serving them back to you in funny ways. So just sort of like looking at this terminal text from the top down, what I'm doing here is I'm basically drawing some notes based on like a little bit of like interpretation of what that note is about and pairing it with some provocations. So we've got pattern. This is from pattern. I'm basically pulling a random note that's tagged pattern. And I've got a set of provocations that are kind of related to pattern-like ideas. So it's asking me, what are some examples of this pattern? And then in the app, I would have like a little call to action where you can hop into this note. The note is action, work, labor. And I could sort of riff on that note. Like this is basically provoking me to think of some concrete examples of the pattern. So the notion here is that like we have these tiny little provocations that are basically jogging me toward gardening my notes in tiny little increments instead of sort of sitting down and like going through your inbox and like, writing out this sort of evergreen note all in one go, which I just don't, I'm not very disciplined. So I'm never going to do that, right? I want to instead kind of slice that up into these tiny little micro interactions. So I'm sort of, going down here. We've got this oblique strategy. I was just sort of, I was like, hey, I love Brian Eno's stuff. So I'm just going to make a Geist that just serves me up Brian Eno's oblique strategies. And I've got one for projects here. It's asking me what is the job to be done, and jobs to be done is a sort of like strategy framework for thinking about projects. I've got one that's tagged question, and it's asking me, the Geist is asking me who might be able to answer this. So the basic idea is, right, we have these little targeted Geists. They each have their own set of spices that they can sort of mix in, and they procedurally generate a little story that ends up on your feed. Now, the eventual notion is that these Geists will basically be Turing complete, like it'll be something like a pure function of your notebook state. For the time being, though, I'm actually I think that a pretty wide range of Geist-like behaviors are expressible as tracery, and I'm starting there because it's kind of cool. It's like you don't actually have to know how to program. Instead, you could kind of take a bunch of JSON files, one for each Geist, and dump them into your notebook, and subconscious will pick them up, and then maybe that also might make it possible for Boris to create his own Geist and share it with me, and maybe I could create a custom Geist and share it with you. And I actually have to say I'm not like the only person who's ever kind of pulled on this thread. There've been way back in the past, there was like an Emacs tool called Remembrance Agent that was kind of, I think it just drew random notes. Then that's it. Basically, that was it. In the Obsidian community, I've noticed that there are people who are like plugin hackers who have been creating tools where along the lines of like you press a button and it will procedurally generate like a creative prompt for writing. These are usually like fiction writers who are like, I'm stumped. And then you click the button and it's like, I procedurally generated you, an idea for a sci-fi story. And then your job is to kind of expand on it. So what I would love to do is kind of generalize that type of tool into like a sort of framework that lives within subconscious. In general, these Geists, I think, are going to be really simple. So rather than this view of the world of like large language models and godlike artificial intelligences, I love this framing of like, be sap, be as smart as a puppy. Like, maybe we actually don't need a divine super intelligence to be creative. Maybe what I want is like less of a godlike, awe-inspiring super intelligence in my notebook and more of a bunch of little puppies running around, fetching things and bringing them to me. And like, we love puppies. They can be kind of dumb, and like that's okay because they're super charming. So that's kind of the design flavor I'm aiming for, rather than like big brain super intelligence. Like let's have a bunch of little wood sprites that are kind of haunting my notebook and doing provocative, funny, interesting things. As inspiration, I have like this a whole bookshelf of sort of what I would think of as like oracular tools. These are all kind of fun, and a lot of them have a kind of game-like quality. Like you'll notice card decks are like a really common format here. They're all dice as well as like RPGs. I think RPGs are like very inspiring to me as procedural storytelling generative systems. So I've been trying to learn a lot from that as I prototype and think about Geists. So it's, it's a very different kind of school of thought from the kind of artificial intelligence, big language model approach. And that's because really my goal is not for the smarts to live in my notebook. What I really want to do is provoke and draw out to educe the creative potential that's already in me. Like if you think about this system as a kind of loop, like a feedback loop between myself and my notes, I really do want it to be between myself and myself, and to kind of like be able to see my ideas from a new point of view. So kind of reframing this as like tools for thought to to tarot for thought. Sorry, I love a good pun. And what's cool about this to me is again, I'm not like the world's best programmer. I'm just one person who's creating a goofy little iOS app that I wanted to exist in the world. It might not have all the features, but and it might be pretty simple. But I actually think that there's ways in which like in this quote, error, differences, misunderstandings between the self and the other can be valued as possible sources of insight and inspiration. So it's not always about like being perfect, right? In some ways, these simple systems, a little bit of randomness, the limitations can be creatively generative. Okay, I sort of promised this would be like a why instead of a how talk. I do want to say like this is maybe just one kind of idiosyncratic riff on what this way of thinking could look like. I think in general, conceiving of note-taking apps as feedback loops that we're constructing might be a useful frame of mind. And I saw this tweet from Maggie the other day, which is like the floor for new note-taking apps now includes bidirectional links, local data, self-hosted, complex block types, transclusion, advanced queries, graph viz, spaced repetition systems, multiplayer, and a slice of cake. Some think we're in hell. And I'm like, yeah, this sounds like hell. Like I have no idea how I'm going to get there. But I think that maybe sort of taking a different theory approach, or like looking at the problem a little differently, might just reveal that there are spaces for interesting products that are adjacent to this particular, like this list of features. It's like solving a particular set of problems, right? And I think there are actually a lot of great products out there that are like LogSec, like Roam, that are solving this problem pretty well. And it's a pretty deep stack. But I think maybe just off to the left or off to the right of that design space, there's a lot of green field. And it just maybe requires a little bit of like lateral thinking with withered technology. At least that is what I like to tell myself. So that's kind of how I'm approaching subconscious. Like this sort of tiara model approach to looking at the problem space is influencing all of my my feature choices, rather than a sort of laundry list of features that are kind of, I guess, table stakes for current tools for thought. So the result will be a little bit different. Maybe it'll succeed, maybe it'll fail, but I'm hoping it'll be different and maybe offer some useful new ideas in the long run. But kind of zooming out, the takeaway I wanted to offer is when you close a loop, you make a flywheel. You're going to produce nonlinear outcomes, and different loops, designing different loops, will produce different results. So you can sort of use this feedback loop thinking and create something like Anki, which will create memorization. Or you might sort of reconceive of it in a different way and create something like subconscious, and where the goal is more like divergent creativity. But this feedback thinking, I think it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around because it's abstract, but it's so important. Like Twitter, Facebook, they get this. There's a reason that when you click that little heart button, it does that little look boop and like the animation. And there's a reason that your notifications work the way they do, and retweets. Like these are all about closing feedback loops to create nonlinear outcomes. And in the case of like Twitter and Facebook, those nonlinear outcomes are like, we want to maximize engagement so that you're seeing ads, so we're making money. So they're basically creating this network of feedback loops around you to basically program an outcome that is good for them. What I'd love to do is sort of craft my own tools, my own feedback loops that produce outcomes that are maybe good for me. Like instead of just sort of wireheading myself and watching advertisements all day, like wouldn't it be cool to construct some sort of feedback loops that cause me to learn ambiently and generate knowledge artifacts ambiently, or create ambiently, or memorize things ambiently? And I don't think that that's such a crazy goal. I really think it just maybe takes a little bit of like tweaking the energy in the system to produce that loop and generate that outcome. So anyway, if you are interested in alpha testing for subconscious, we'd love to have you. Just fair warning, there are no Geists yet. I'm still building them. And what we have today that's working is a sort of like mobile notational velocity flavored type tool. But one step at a time. And yeah, we'd love you to give it a shot. I'll post this link. It's kind of long. I'll post it in the chat as well. But yeah, that's me. Any questions?
Let's do a round of jazz hands to start with those for video on.
Love the jazz hands.
Which, for those that don't know, is ASL for clapping. We'll work on a couple more. Bill, go ahead.
I love what you're doing with this. I love the like simple things, trying to create kind of a bizarre mental synergy. I think that's an awesome approach to things. What I'd like to get a little better handle on is the output of all this. And you talk about ideas and the fact that you're a designer, maybe it's very driven by the kinds of things you design.
Totally.
This is a thing I struggle with all the time. Like at what point is this becoming sense making versus wanking? And so trying to have a sense of like, what's the definition of good output is something I'd like to get your thoughts on.
Well, don't ask me, because as a designer, there is no distinction between the two. Because like the whole point is to construct something new. So I think that there are lots of fields of work where like there are right answers, right? And so like veering off into like whatever is maybe going to be like not useful. But I think when you're talking about things like art and design, there's obviously like there are value judgments in there. But often the generation of novelty is itself a step in a useful direction. It might not be the answer, right? But my goal is actually not for the notebook to provide me with the answers. My goal is for the notebook to help knock me into a frame of mind where I can be more generative and arrive at the answer. So like that to use another cybernetics term, the requisite variety is in me, not in the notebook. But your mileage may vary. Again, I'm sort of hoping that maybe this way of thinking, it would be cool if maybe I'm like off in territory that doesn't make sense. But if this is useful, I kind of hope to see other people take it and run with it in other directions. Because I think that there's a pretty big design space here to solve different sorts of problems. And again, just like the enormous sort of goal difference between something like Anki versus something like subconscious. Like these are structurally very very similar systems, but the outcomes are potentially very different. So I think it like if those are two poles, like I think there are probably other poles as well. I'd like to see actually what you do with it, Bill, because you're one of the OGs. I love your site. There's a lot going on there.
Cool, thanks.
Dalton.
Yeah, thanks. I think what you're working on is fantastic, and I wasn't very familiar with it, and then this morning I kind of did, read most of the blog posts and watched the interview.
gosh.
Like, man, this is like, I'm very much in the same headspace right now, and it's funny how I agree very strongly about how much unexplored territory there is here. I feel like there's kind of like a strong convergence around a very specific set of tools for thought tools, and it's just like barely scratching the surface as far as I can tell. I think to me, one of the biggest turning points is going to be when there's better ways for us to collaborate. And I just wanted to, I guess, put out one intuition I have there and see what you think about it, and then just kind of hear you riff on that a little bit. But I guess without getting into specifics about how that would work, I feel like that point is kind of when we can actually run each other's tools within our own tools. So I guess kind of a motivating thought I've had is like, what would so I guess like back in the ARPA era, there were the ints, right? The kind of what got them online to the early ARPANET. And so you had these people who are all working on very different systems, but able to kind of see what each other were up to and try things out and share knowledge in that way. And I feel like, yeah, again, just the kind of the intuition is that being able to actually, have like run times that are actually kind of like live up in each other's systems seems like an inflection point.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. One is there's this great interview with Bill Atkinson, the inventor of HyperCard. Like HyperCard is one of these amazing evolutionary kind of like directions that could have become the web. But the interesting thing about HyperCard is it didn't have networking at all. It was like a great hypertext system that was very like sort of everything was read write. It was like super user friendly. People did a lot of cool creative stuff with it, but it didn't have HTTP. And you had to basically share your HyperCard stacks over floppy disks. So like Bill Atkinson is saying like he worked at Apple, and Apple in his sort of diagram thinking like of boxes and arrows, like Apple thought about boxes, right? Like this is the computer and that's another computer, and each of these computers is a box. And he was like, well, if I had been at some place like Sun Microsystems, and Sun is a networking company, they think about arrows. Like the boxes are just like fungible, right? We don't care. We care about the arrows. He's like, maybe HyperCard would have been the first web browser, right? I love that kind of thought experiment. I've been trying to channel that. I admittedly, because I'm not like a big brain programmer, like a lot of these kind of multiplayer problems are the hard problems, right? Like this is the stuff that people like Boris are working on at Fission. And there's like a lot of hard research stuff. But our goal is to get there. Like this is kind of buried, I guess, in my talk, but like this Pask's conversation theory, right? Like I'm like, well, you can have a conversation between yourself and your notes and yourself, and it's like, yeah, but you can also have a conversation between yourself and other people. And actually, maybe what I would like to get to in the long run is something that's a little bit like a weird hybrid of Twitter and a wiki. And so that's kind of my big grand vision, but like we're a ways out from that. We're like building a multiplayer backend, but we have all these ideological commitments. Like I want you to own your data. I don't want to be another centralized service. Ideally, I'm also not a peer-to-peer genius. So we're trying to find like some sort of compromise that like leaves people in control. And it's a tough mountain to climb, as Boris knows. But hopefully we'll sort of we'll climb to base camp at least while Boris like goes to the peak. Maybe we can like follow in your wake at Fission. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to take a long-term view and just take it one step at a time.
Indy.
Well, you kind of just answered it, Gordon, because my question was basically like, what about, a conversation between you, your notes, and someone else? But I just want to express my admiration for your insight in bringing past conversation theory into this and putting it together with convergence divergence. I'd been thinking about it for a while, but
It's the other way around. I stumbled upon Pask, and it was like suddenly I saw this space in a completely different way. It was like this mind-blowing moment. So blame Pask, not me.
No, I'm really looking forward to how it develops.
Yeah, hopefully it'll all work out.
And I have ideas for Geist, but maybe that's comes later.
Yeah. So one thing I would love to get to is like, if a Geist can be a pure function over your nodes. So basically, the idea is it runs within a sandbox. It reads your notes in. It outputs some sort of feed of stories. This is actually technically a little bit tricky to do in a secure way, which I would love to do it in a secure way so that you can sort of safely kind of load stuff over the wire. I'm also struggling with like, the Apple App Store doesn't allow certain things, which probably means such a thing is going to have to run in a server rather than on the client, which means there has to be a server in my there's a bunch of stuff I don't need to get into. We're trying to figure it out, which is why I'm just like, okay, let's start with something simple. We'll start with tracery. I feel confident that you can get to like 60% of useful sort of use cases, and then we'll work our way toward the right thing.
And I did put my hand up to put myself in queue. Just wanted to reiterate that I think that this sense making versus wankery, as coined by Bill, is in fact something that I know that I struggle with it. Like why am I using this note-taking tool? What am I adopting over a period of time, and what am I getting out of it? And this is a discussion that I had with a friend and mentor of mine that we have been blogging and RSS reading for 20 years. And we sat down the other day, and I realized that like the very basics of just applying some sense making over the output of my own actions is not something that is just available yet. And so I'm very inspired by just like, again, a lot of those things that I think that there are, I want to support that. I think there's some very simple things that can be done here to do that conversation with yourself. His particular point that I wanted to share was he realized that he had been going through a mode, and he had been very diligently using Roam in a very particular way. And when he looked back over his notes, he realized that this conversation with himself had become rote. He needed external inputs to go like, no, I'm not actually thinking new things. I'm just following some tracks at this point. And I thought that was really insightful.
I've also seen people sort of complain that their Roam has become like a giant like graph of stuff that is not curated. And like, to me, this is not actually, I think maybe it is not a knock on Roam as a product. It's just like it's a broken feedback loop. It's like the people who use Roam effectively, they're creating some sort of feedback system. It might even be that they're forcing themselves to sit down once a week. Like I see a lot of people who are like effective with knowledge management. They do this. They have like an inbox somewhere, and then they triage it. And like, that's great. I don't have willpower though, so it's not great for me. And so I want that to be automated. Like, even for me, the dumbest version of subconscious would be like, instead of showing me a reverse chronological list of notes, like just give me a random, like like even that is going to be more fruitful than a sort of like having to sit down and triage.
I did want to ask one more thing about this. Don't worry, it's just little ideas. I briefly, but we hadn't dug into it. I kind of gave you this feedback that I'm like, okay, I have many places that I need to type, work or personal. How do I start using subconscious How do I commit to it? And do you have any thoughts on how people can bring subconscious into their lives?
Yes, a couple. I have a cold start problem right now, and this is largely a byproduct of just like not being able to build stuff fast enough. So one of the reasons I decided to build a native app instead of web, I'm like a big web person. I worked on browsers for years, but you don't get unmitigated access to the share sheet if you are a web page, which is stinky, but it's the world that I live in. And so that's a big one. I think just it sounds goofy, but at least for me, like 80% of the note taking I do is like grabbing snippets on my mobile phone. So I want to make that easy. It's not there yet in the product. Additionally, there's just a lot of missing features. Like there's no desktop store yet. There will be. Geist aren't there yet. I think that'll help mitigate some of the cold start problem.
Again, I think that's already really helpful. Like if you're suggesting, and I want to get this from you, like I am happy to nominate subconscious for my link stash. In the fact that I'm like not a joke, 200 tabs on mobile as my primary consumption review device.
Mm-hmm. Something I would even like to do, and this is not a promise because it's like I can't wait to get there. I don't know how long it'll take me, but like, why does my notebook not create a plain text archive version of every link in my corpus? Like that just, and then I'll have full text search over my corner of the internet. I really want to get there. But whatever, we all have priorities. And like, there's two of us right now. So, but yeah, I want to sort of like, hopefully aim for a kind of ambient workflow where you're not, yeah, maybe this won't work for everyone, actually. I think a lot of tools like Roam and Obsidian are great at this kind of knowledge management as like almost like an RPG campaign where you're like looking at your graph and it's growing and you feel, super like, wow, I didn't even know I was that smart. And I think that really works for a certain kind of personality. But I'm like a disorganized, flighty, ADD. I want like little tiny kind of ambient micro interactions rather than a view from above. Sorry,
Yeah.
I spun off there. I don't
No,
know.
it's good. It's that there's so many like again, there's no right answer for this, right? I'm 20 years in. I'm happy to like audition another tool, especially one that's fairly plain texty. That is the thing that has survived for me.
Yeah, one other thing. We've been biasing toward plain text. It's actually a weird flavor of markdowny like thing, and the goal is it's sort of we've modified the semantics of the markup in such a way that it will support a block-based editor in the future. But I wanted this stuff to make a reasonable amount of sense in plain text because I've used tools in the past that have gone out of business, and then it was like, download your morass of XML. And I'm a programmer and I still couldn't, make sense of it. Like Evernote was rough, and I don't know. This is a very difficult problem to solve, but I'm hoping to at least offer people flat files, plain text, JSON at a minimum where plain text can't make sense. And it would be really cool over the long run if this was something that you could actually interoperate over multiple tools.
I'll ask one more question / give a suggestion. One is how can we help? And maybe a suggestion of some of those things as well is like the Geist things obviously looks like a sort of thing that one might start working on some transforms or other things like that. So I think there's probably lots of people here where if you said, here's how we think Geists might work.
I have two things. Okay. One is please be an alpha tester and please be patient. And the other is, so actually on the patience note, maybe by patient, I mean, just don't expect it to be Roam. It's like, I once had a conversation with Connor where he was like, oh, I want to build the Emacs of thought. And I was like, that's beautiful. I want to build the Nano of thought, just like the dumb, simple tool. But maybe the second thing is, this is kind of a weird ask, but I've been looking for the right IP lawyer to help me set up a strong copyleft dual licensing scheme for Subconscious. So this might be popular or unpopular, but my notion is I've done it both. I've done the commercial stuff and I've done the pure open source stuff. And I think that there might be a hybrid approach that could work here where the code is open source under a strong copyleft license such that it will always live on. But it's copyleft in such a way that, like, you know, the Amazons and Googles and Microsofts of the world can't just take it and run away with it without contributing back. And that there is a revenue stream that's pointed back toward development, and that it's actually commercially, hopefully viable. And maybe I can even take VC money at some point when I'm done bootstrapping. So this is an unusual thing. I think MongoDB is doing it. There are some other folks that are doing it. I'm going to try to do it, but you need a little bit of like lawyerly advice to do it right. So if anyone knows a good IP lawyer, let me know.
Dropped a link to Kyle Mitchell. He's in the Bay Area, and he's also open to novel approaches. He's got
yes,
some.
And I'm not asking for pro bono either. Like I have
the
money. So
he literally has some licenses that have come up recently, and this is very much something that Jeff Litt actually mentioned about Twemix as well, of kind of wanting to do a little bit of both, and I think it's an interesting space to explore. I'm going to stop the recording button, but let's have one more round of jazz hands. Thank you. Very great.